costs are going to go up a ton. But we don't have to talk about Tesla all day. We have this question from Mark. I believe that could be your pseudonym. Says he is hugely bullish on Airbnb. What are your thoughts on the company? Paul, do you follow this at all? I know we follow it fairly closely. It's on the watch list, but interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, honestly, I use Airbnb. I actually managed for a time my parents' Airbnb
Nice.
when they were trying to make some extra money. Um, it's a great service. The way that they've evolved over time has been excellent. I'm not gonna lie to you. When 2020 rolled around, I'm like, oh God, these guys are dead. you know. Um, and then we were all pleasantly surprised because then everybody decided to just like leave their home and then plant their flag elsewhere for the time being. Obviously, they're paying money for it. My issue with Airbnb is that the, if you look at the I guess housing supply issues going on in the country right now, it really gets the problem exacerbates itself because of all the people who are invested in real estate, not just like as a rental properties or second homes, third homes, like whatever, even from these big funds, aka Blackstone. But you have people who have like bought homes to rent specifically just on Airbnb, right? And it's funny because I remember seeing one picture on Twitter, and I forget who it was from. So I'm sorry if you're listening to this and I didn't quote you, but he showed a picture of the housing crisis in New Orleans, Louisiana, and like how many homes like deficit there was in because people there's just not enough homes for people. And then he shows a side by side of the exact same map um, of an area where it's like on Zillow for sale, and then another map where it's the same location of Airbnb listings, and it just like this thing just lights up. It's all those little pin drops, and my problem with it is that it's making a housing crisis worse because everybody wants to like. It's not just people who are renting out their current place; it's people who are just keep buying more places to rent out those places. And I know years ago, urban cities like my city, New York City, fought back on Airbnb, saying like, you know what, like, you're a short stay, like we thrive on hotels here, blah 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 blah. If your Airbnb is less than 30 days, you can't do it. It has to be at least 30 days. And that basically shut down like tons of people. I mean, illegal operations still pop up all the time, but my problem with them is like, I don't know if there's a point where government policy is just like, you got to fix this somehow because you're just making the problem worse. That's my biggest concern with them. As far as like pricing action right now or valuation, I don't really keep up with it that much. It's more so like the underlying problem of what business it's running and what type of situation the American like housing system is in right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. We had a comment here, another probably anecdote that a lot of people have where they were staying at a house and some of the other people that lived there had been there for like over a year. I assume he's saying he's on Airbnb. The long-term stays has been a big change. I think there is a dynamic there that it's un it happens so quickly that I think some of the things coming out of that are it's TBD. And I really worry. Here's one thing. I'm going to share my screen that has using Stratosphere that has a great KPI that I think highlights this point over the last few years. And it is the average daily rate on the platform. Can you guys see that? Yeah. So
Yeah.
if we look really, the average daily rate is just what, a night costs at an Airbnb place on average. So some are going to be a lot more, some are going to be a lot less. If we look at kind of the 2015 to 2019 period, and right, at the beginning of COVID, I guess, the average daily rate was stable at about 100. What are we at here? About 110 to 120. But the last 2 years, it has jumped up to $160, which has been a huge accelerant to Airbnb's revenue growth. And I just worry that if we normalize back, because I don't know why this happened, frankly, and maybe it's some of the reasons you outlined, Paul, but if that normalizes back, that's going to really hurt their revenue in the short run. So I think just from my view, I like the business model. I think they have a really great track record. They have great brand value. They have some key competitive advantages, but right now it
Well,
remains on the watch list just
And
because the near term, I am very concerned about it.
shouldn't long-term stays like hurt that more than help it too? Because it'll be like a lower average daily rate.
Yes, good point. They typically, as I've done longer term stays before, typically people will do a 20%, 30% discount for longer term stays.
Having been a manager of an Airbnb listing, we actually wanted the longer stays because when you think about it, stable cash flow at that point. And it's actually really interesting because when my parents were doing it, the people who mainly stayed at their listing, which was their home, um, it was families who had just sold their homes and they were basically in the middle of transitioning to their new home that they purchased. So they just needed a place to basically bridge that gap between, hey, we sold our home, we can't move into our home yet. There's that. And then you had a lot of people who came in and were like, hey, I'm just like in town to see some family real quick or for a conference or like whatever. And you had like those type of people. When you look at the KPI that you just showed on Stratosphere, I think it's a factor of two things. One, yeah, I mean, you just had to how supply and demand just explode. Like that's like honestly like one of the biggest things. And if I know you guys have heard me tell about this a lot, but I'm thinking if there's a huge consumer slowdown back to pre-19 levels. So I'm expecting things to renormalize back to pre-19 eventually after it overshoots to a downside. So if my hypothesis is correct, it's like, all right, well, that supply demand issue will normalize as people like are like, okay, hey, I've traveled enough after COVID. I can like cool it down now. I don't know when that's going to be, right? Because a lot of consumer spending has shifted from goods to services and travel and experiences, which is Airbnb's domain. The other part of this, which I know you've probably seen, is everybody getting angry about the cleaning fees. And again, as a manager of one, yes, as soon as I found out that I could get basically better margins on my cleaning fee if I charge it, I would make it more expensive because I could get to capture more margin for my parents by charging that. So it wasn't ridiculous. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like charging a stupid amount of money, but it was like, hey, I could actually squeeze out an extra like, depending on the stay, like 30, 40, $50 per person. Like, yeah, but then people have rioted because, like they're saying like, you search for an Airbnb, it says $200 a night, but then you price everything out and it's like 400 because of cleaning fees and taxes,
Yeah.
And I think it's a combination of those two things. The ability to manipulate your listing to juice your sales, and then also just pure supply demand shock.
Yeah. At the same time, I do see a world where I think it's very like I think it's very easy to just envision a world where Airbnb is much bigger in 5 to 10 years. I know it's like kind of a boring thesis to go off of, but it seems like
I mean, it's
it's
not because at that point, it's like, what multiple are you paying for it then? If you think it can
Yeah.
just continuously grow, what multiple are you going to pay?
yeah.
What are you going to underwrite?
Yeah, the two things I'm looking at is one, that ADR, the average daily rate. I I'm just very nervous about that. If I was looking at them, you could say, okay, maybe they're fairly cheap-ish on their current multiple versus the growth you expect over the long term. And then second, I think these are when you talk about the consumer stuff, you reminded me, Paul. I believe you've been tweeting about this or sharing stuff about that. And a lot of people have shared this chart is the consumer savings rate went from 30% down to 2%. And we talked about this once on the show, and that doesn't mean people are going to have negative savings because they did pile up some stuff. But eventually, or I guess what the 2% means right now is that there is just a ton of, and I know everyone hates using this term, dry powder in consumers' pockets that is coming out right now, right? And I wonder what that's going to look like. I think that does play into your thesis, I'm assuming, Paul, for the consumer slowdown in
Well,
2023.